We are particularly happy today to have with us David McMahan, a professor from Franklin and Marshall University here in the United States. David has written The Making of Buddhist Modernism, one of the most important books on the subject of the recent history of the way in which Buddhism has reshaped itself, both in its original Asian context as well as in its importation and adaptation into other parts of the world. Today we'll be talking with David about this work and the broader subjects of religion and secularism, the way in which Buddhist meditation has been adapted, and the way in which that agenda may be subverting, to some degree, the goals that the proponents of Buddhist meditation purport to advocate. So thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So we'd like to begin by just hearing a little bit about how you got here. How did you first study Buddhism? How did you get involved with projects you've been working on the last number of years in terms of Buddhism in the modern world? Just Buddhism and the modern world. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, I'm not a very likely person to have become at all interested in Buddhism because I grew up evangelical Christian, and once I started when I was a teenager sort of questioning my faith, I just happened to come across a book or two on Buddhism as well as a number of other things, and when I got to college there happened to be a Zen priest who had just come to the university at the same time I had, and I learned some meditation from him, and he taught a couple classes at the university on Buddhism, and began to get interested in that. At the same time I was studying Western philosophy, and I've always maintained an interest in Western thought as well, philosophy, social thought, and so on. So I majored in philosophy actually, and psychology as an undergraduate. And I didn't know anything about religious studies because where I went we didn't have a religious studies department. And when I started thinking about graduate school and going on and possibly studying Asian philosophy, I realized very quickly that there were practically no philosophy departments anywhere that did that, and that if you wanted to study Asian philosophy you had to go to a religious studies department. And so I started looking around at religious studies departments and then ended up pursuing that. My graduate training actually in Buddhism was in South Asia. It was not in Buddhism in the modern world. And I worked with Pali texts and Sanskrit texts, and mainly did work on visual metaphors. My first book and dissertation was on visual metaphors in Mahayana sutras. So I guess the modernity question started to come up because, one, I had already been studying modern Western philosophy and been interested in it, but I also, in looking at ancient Buddhist texts, just kept on coming back to the fact that, you know, a lot of people, if you look just at the past 100 years or so of people studying classical Buddhist texts, you see how their interpretations really change drastically along with the Western intellectual fashions. So, you know, for a while, Nagarjuna, one of the people that I worked on for a while in graduate school, was modeled on Wittgenstein. For a while he was talked about as a kind of Heideggerian. For a while earlier than that he was modeled on Kant and interpreted through that lens. And later he became a kind of postmodernist. So I realized that the lenses through which people were seeing these texts had radical effects on how these texts come to us. And that sort of brought the question of reflexivity and where we are in the modern world and what kind of lenses we view Buddhism and other ancient traditions through. And then I guess in the past 20 or so years I've just noticed the rise in prominence of Buddhism in the West, and how certain themes and images and so on of Buddhism have just become a part of our cultural baggage. And that's been interesting to me too. So I started to take more of an interest in how certain images of Buddhism came about, and certain images of Buddhism when I first started to get attracted to Buddhism in college, how they were in some ways shattered when I went to Asia. And for instance, I spent 6 months backpacking around Asia when I was actually supposed to be staying in one place studying Sanskrit. And it was an amazing trip because I saw all kinds of things that, even with my extensive reading of both kind of Western popular Buddhist texts and classical Buddhist texts, I wasn't really prepared for at all. And so I started to think, okay, so how was the picture that I had of Buddhism before I started to see Buddhism more on the ground? How was that shaped, and what kind of cultural forces in my own world contributed to that? And so in thinking about those questions, I started to come to the book that I wrote, Making of Buddhist Modernism.
So that book it's about a century's worth of history,
Mm-hmm.
give or take.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a particular period within more recent history that you think is a lot of foundational work was done in cultural terms in building the Buddhism that we have now in North America? Is there a fulcrum point?
Well, yeah, I think there are. I don't know if there's one
Mm-hmm.
fulcrum point, but I think there are a number of really important sort of historical periods. I mean, the first one really is the late 19th, early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when, for the first time, Westerners started to take a sympathetic interest in Buddhism. Before that, they were mostly, studying Buddhism from a missionary standpoint in order to sort of understand what they're trying to displace. And, with the World's Parliament of Religions, for instance, in late 19th century, Unitarians, there started to become a kind of discourse of world religions that was more friendly towards other traditions. And I think that was the period in which certain features of what I call Buddhist modernism really got started, especially the alliance between Buddhism and science, or the attempt to articulate Buddhism in terms of a kind of scientific worldview. Really starts to take shape in that period, in part in reaction to the colonization and missionization of Buddhist countries. While all the missionaries and the colonists are depicting Buddhism as this kind of superstitious mumbo jumbo, Buddhists themselves push back against that by saying, look, we've got this very sophisticated philosophy, and in many ways we don't have the same kind of problems that you guys have, you Christians, with things like evolution, with kind of, ethereal view of the soul, or something like things that educated Westerners were starting to become skeptical of in the context of this very positivistic, kind of triumphalistic scientistic worldview of the time. So that I think is one big important chapter in the development of Buddhist modernism. Then I think another important chapter is, I guess, the introduction of Zen to the West, primarily from D.T. Suzuki, who presents Zen very much in the mode, in some ways, sort of as a counterbalance to the scientific presentation of Buddhism. He is riding kind of on the wave of transcendentalism. He's reading Emerson and Thoreau, German idealists, and so on. And he's presenting Zen in that kind of language. And that, in turn, I think, leads to probably, if there is a big fulcrum point in the more recent past, it's probably the counterculture, the Beats, the hippie movement in the 60s, that they have a whole other kind of romantic appropriation of Buddhism. And now I think if there's another wave, it is kind of the neuroscientific wave. And Buddhism, or especially Buddhist meditation, is being presented to the broader public as a kind of quasi-scientific technique, and certainly as a technique that can be studied scientifically. And a lot of, kind of big, broad, wide conclusions are being offered to the public, often second and third hand by journalists who are talking to people about brain scans and MRIs and stuff like that. So I think that's kind of the most recent wave that, again, is in a way a kind of circling back to the original framing of Buddhism as in harmony with science. And I think without that first move, it would have been harder to make the moves that are being made today.
So how do you think we got from the late 60s explosion of counterculture and this new openness to Buddhism and so forth to where we are today in 2014, where we see Buddhist forms of practice, contemplative practice, ideas and so forth have really become pervasive? What were the key things? Because neuroscience is a relatively recent and also rather elite in terms of its practice and conception. But over that 4-decade period, what were the key things that made the transition from the hippies of the 60s to mom and dad today?
Well, the hippies grew up and got jobs and, and became neuroscientists. And I think, people, and of course the utopianism of the 60s didn't really work out. We're not living in the country that was envisioned back then. And so a lot of sociologists have noted that there was a kind of turning inward after that period. Distrust of political institutions, of public institutions. And this is a part of a wider trend, I think, of distrust of religious institutions. So there has been, I think, for over a century, the idea that one maybe could be religious in some way without being tied to what is often considered, sort of in our culture, oppressive and dogmatic religious institutions. And so there's always been a kind of hunger for that and an attempt to actualize that. And so it may be that framing meditation in terms of other kind of not so religious categories is a part of that. And of course the category is spirituality that's pervasive now. The rise of this notion of a kind of trans-cultural, trans-religious spirituality is very appealing to a lot of people, because I think they, when they do start to look at traditions like Buddhism, after a while, if you honestly start to read and read a considerable amount of literature, you'll come up against things that really do challenge certain kind of common sense Western assumptions. And so there are a lot of people who want to be into Buddhism. It's interesting that you can be into Buddhism in a way that you can't be into Presbyterianism or something in this country. So it shows that there is a way of kind of embracing certain aspects and practicing certain aspects of Buddhism without really embracing the whole package. And so I think that's been a trend, and the idea that you can just do meditation without signing on to the whole package has been attractive to a lot of people.